This is Arnold Brown. He was a rifle company commander in the 90th Infantry Division. In 1936, in rural Kentucky, Arnold hopped a freight train and enlisted in the Army because he said he was tired of eating cornbread and molasses 3 times a day. World War II was probably the last war where it was possible for someone with an 8th grade education to become a company commander with 150 men under his protection by the end of the war, and a colonel by the time he retired. The great oral historian Studs Terkel wrote a book called The Good War, in which he interviewed a lot of World War II veterans. There's no such thing as a good war, Arnold said. World War II was a must war. Arnold is one of the many veterans that I've interviewed over the years. But there's one more quote from him I'd like to share. It was shortly after he arrived in Normandy as a replacement officer in the 90th Division. The division had seen heavy fighting in the month after D-Day, June of 1944. And this is what he said. After the reorganization, when we were moving up to the front, we were under long-range artillery fire. An artillery shell exploded nearby, and a piece of shrapnel from this artillery shell struck a boy in the head. He couldn't have been, well, he was somewhere between 18 and 21 years of age. And I can hear him today, his cry out and the way his voice trailed off as he dropped dead. He said, "Mom." It gave me the chills. That was my first casualty. He was one of the 405,399 to be killed in World War II. He became a statistic. He was a statistic to everyone except his mother and his other loved ones. And I've often wondered, how is the selection made? He hadn't seen an enemy. He hadn't fired a weapon. In 1980, when I was 30 years old, my father was in the hospital after having a heart attack. I thought, I'll buy a little tape recorder and get him talking about the war. I forgot to bring it when I went to visit, and I never got another chance. 7 years passed, and I moved back into my parents' old apartment in New York. I discovered my father was dead 7 years. He's still getting mail. Telly Savalas, you remember Telly Savalas would send him letters and invite him to come on a junket to Atlantic City. My parents liked to gamble a bit, quite a bit, in fact. Then one day, he got a newsletter from his old army outfit, the 712th Tank Battalion. I thought, I forgot he was a tanker even. I'd been very busy the last 10 years, So I wrote to the newsletter, and I said, if anybody remembers Lieutenant Elson, would they get in touch with me? This was 1987. And I got a letter back saying, I didn't know your father. It was from a fellow named Sam McFarland. I didn't know your father, but we're having a reunion. Come to the reunion. I'll take you around. We'll see what we can find. So I went to that reunion in Niagara Falls, it was the American side. And I found three veterans who remembered my dad. All the stories that he told when I was younger came back to life. You know, it was a life-changing experience. But at the same time, the stories that I would walk into the middle of and be glued until they finished, I'd hear them in the parking lot, in the hotel lobby, the hospitality room. I was so moved by these stories that I went back. I missed the next reunion, but I went 2 years later. This time I remembered the tape recorder. That's 38 or 39 years and almost 1,000 hours of recorded interviews and group conversations later. Here I am. I'd like to share a couple of the stories. I can't tell them all, but I'd like to share a couple of the stories I've recorded with you. This is a column of tanks from my father's battalion heading into the Battle of the Bulge. They're in a place called Bavine, B-A-V-I-G-N-E, Bavine, Luxembourg. The picture was taken on January 8th, 1945. In the second tank, that's Sam McFarland. I never got the reason he's like standing up like that indicates that they were not being shot at. But in the next few days, that would change dramatically. I never got to interview Sam because the following year he wrote to the newsletter and he said, "Time is succeeding where Hitler failed." And he died of cancer in 1991. Okay, that's Sam. It's kind of silhouetted. It was a grainy old picture, you know, so it didn't work out so good when I blew it up. This is the lieutenant in the first tank on the, let's see, that would be him there. Okay, that's Wallace Lippincott. About 10 years ago, a veteran I had interviewed from the 90th Division had gone back to Europe, and a friend of his, Norbert, who was an avid military collector, lives in Luxembourg, had a license to whatever he found in the woods. He found a canteen in the woods with Lieutenant Lippincott's name etched in the side. A few days after this picture was taken, January 14, 1945, Wally Lippincott was killed in Brass, Luxembourg. So this collector finds his, you know, maybe 15 years ago, he had this canteen with his name and serial number etched into its side, and he wanted to return it to his family, but he had no luck finding anyone in the family through the internet, other connections. So he gives the canteen to the veteran who said, "Bring it back to the States, see if you can find someone." And he knew that I was a historian of this battalion. So he calls me up and he tells me about it, says, "Do you know anyone in the family?" I won't go into detail, but Facebook was involved, and I found Wally's great nephew, Ted Nobles, right? Now, I'm a former newspaper copy editor, but I have newspapers in my blood, before the current crop of newspapers. But I thought I'll pitch this story. Wally was from Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, and the nephew, Ted, was from Delaware. So I pitched the story to a columnist at the Philadelphia Inquirer. And he was interested, and he talked to Ted, the nephew, and he said, will you wait until Christmas? It was near Christmas. Don't write this before Christmas. I want to surprise my sister with the canteen. Show it to her. Christmas morning, the column comes out, and he ended the column. The nephew said that Wally had a widow, but he only met her once. It was his great aunt. And she had remarried. He didn't know her last name. And he only knew her as Aunt Libby. So the story comes out, and the last line of the column, Dan Rubin, a really good writer at the Philly Inquirer, the story comes out, and the last line, Ted says, Aunt Libby, where are you? He didn't know if she was alive or not even. She would have been in her 90s. Aunt Libby, where are you? Christmas morning at a nursing home in Canonsburg, Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh, a telephone rings. A woman picks it up and says, hello. And this is what she hears. Mom, you're on the front page of the Inquirer. Now, this is the Philadelphia Inquirer, not the National Inquirer, but being from Pennsylvania, she would have known. Now, you're on the front page of the Inquirer. Now, Ted, the nephew, wanted to deliver the canteen in person, but he was having car trouble, so he said, I'm going to send it. Now, Vern, the veteran who brought the canteen over, lives in Fresno, California, decides he's going to fly. He's still alive, by the way, at 100. But this is 10 years ago, decides he's going to fly out from Fresno to be there when she gets the canteen. So I kind of got shamed into driving out from Connecticut because I wanted to be there. But, Vern's flight was delayed. So I got to talk to Aunt Libby for 5 hours. Meanwhile, the Inquirer did a follow-up. The columnist called Aunt Libby and talked to her, and she sent him photos and such. That was Wally. And that was the canteen. And she says 712 TK. It's got a serial number. And it said, I think LT Lippincott, Wal, W-A-L. Anyway, and then it says sauerkraut on the bottom. And that was they were married 5 months. They met at the University of Delaware, where they were both students. She remarried a Navy veteran, and then she had a kind of a rough life, but he came down with cancer, and she was a caregiver for a long time, and she was very depressed after the war. But then she got a job as a customer service rep at Eastern Airlines. And she was working in the airport, and she'd meet all these celebrities and interesting people. So that cheered her up quite a bit. Back to the picture of the tank. Oh, there's Aunt Libby with the canteen. She's passed away, but she slept with it under her pillow after these artifacts from the war. To somebody like me or somebody, the canteen is like a chunk of metal. But to have something like that from somebody you've lost, and this is repeated throughout the war, that through families, little artifact. That figure that Arnold Brown gave, 400 and whatever it was, every one of those families, would love something like that if they, and many of them did get some things like that. Now, what the heck is this? Okay, this guy here. This is the tank driver, Des Tibbets. He grew up on a ranch in California and was a rodeo cowboy for 10 years after the war. And then he became a brand inspector. He lived in Orland, California. I still have, when I went out to, I flew into San Francisco, rented a car, and drove up Route 5, and I still have a souvenir mug from the High Low Cafe in Weed, California. I saw that, I found that the other day. But anyway, there's Des Tibbets on his horse Snuffy. He was 76 when I'm 76 now myself when I interviewed him, and he was nursing an injury he got from roping a calf or doing something ranch wise. Now again, this not a very good. The fellow in the last tank, this here, was Sergeant Hank Schneider. Hank got a battlefield commission, meaning he was promoted from sergeant to lieutenant because they were losing so many lieutenants who came in, like my father came in, was wounded right away almost. But he was an original sergeant, got a battlefield commission to lieutenant on March 18th, 1945. And the day that he got his lieutenant bars, he was killed by a sniper. He had a reputation as a ladies' man. He was always flirting with women. He got married in training, and he had a son was born while he was overseas. So the son grew up without a father. One day at one of the reunions, the son, as an adult, came to the reunion. I didn't know it. He had a different last name, the same last name as the battalion's colonel. So I thought it was one of his sons. And I didn't know that until one of the veterans from Schneider's company said that when the son was introduced, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. That okay, what's next? We got, all right. I'm going to play an audio clip. One thing that, from what I do, I recorded all my interviews, almost all of them. And the audio, there's no substitute. I've written books. There's no substitute for the voice. The veterans will laugh when you think you should be crying. You'll get all choked up at something funny, and they'll provide sound effects. This fellow, when he was wounded, he was in the 82nd Airborne Division, a paratrooper. And when he was wounded in Normandy, he said, "Wang, they nailed me beautiful." Anyway, I'm just going to play I'll go to the next one.
Flying in camp. Oh, yeah. I think so. And then I'm writing that up. And then we had breakfast and everything. And I remember that I was standing in the tent. I go, this kid, Johnny Dawn. Johnny was really like, yeah, John Dawn, Johnny, we call him Johnny. Skinny kid, didn't look no more than 16 years old. Tall headed, you know. And he's standing there like a statue, looking into space. And I looked at him, I went and I said, hey, Johnny. So then he took out, doing out of there, and I was sort of more along with it. He said, hey, I haven't heard it. I said, well, what's the matter, Johnny? Hey, Johnny. And he said, I was a stupid. Hey, what's the matter with you? And he says, I'm going to just like that. No, that's what I said. Some of us live, some of us don't, but you ain't going to do one. He was one of the first guys killed. I can see you observing one of the fellows said it. He ran out the light tonight and see him block both together. So he's staying there the rest of their life.
He was a veteran of the 82nd Airborne Division, parachuted into Normandy on the early morning of D-Day. Tom Stumpner of Eagle Lake, Wisconsin, had an Uncle Bud who was killed in the war. Tom's mother would never talk about her brother, and Tom only knew him as Uncle Bud. He didn't even know his real name. He knew he was a paratrooper, but he didn't know what a paratrooper did. I'm going to digress here a little bit. Sam Filer, a dentist in the 101st Airborne Division and a veteran of the Battle of Bastogne, knew his mother, who was from Eastern Europe and was very protective, would never approve of him volunteering for the Airborne. When she asked him what paratroopers did, he told her they dropped things on the enemy. He didn't tell her he was one of those things. When Tom's mother was ill, she gave him a box. In it were letters, pictures, a folded up flag, and a Purple Heart, and other memorabilia from his Uncle Bud. And for the first time, he learned his uncle's real name, John Dorm. Now, Tom watched Band of Brothers, and he started reading books about the war. Imagine his surprise when he's reading The Americans at Normandy by John McManus, and he comes across Ed Bacafogli's description of Johnny Dorm's premonition. I was like an endnote in his book, the book called The Americans at Normandy, and he comes across Ed's description of Johnny Dorm's premonition to give you some idea of what he might have felt at that. One time, when I was sitting at a table at a reunion of my father's tank battalion, reading a company log in which there was a description of the patrol on which my father was wounded. This was in the middle of a pitch black night, and the patrol, it was a foot patrol, was returning from behind enemy lines. I came across a line that said, Lieutenant Elson was wounded by small arms fire. This I knew. And then it said, possibly from our own side. Paul Wanamaker, the battalion secretary, like to say, I jumped so high out of my seat that I nearly hit my head on the ceiling. Now Tom, like me, was really excited by what he was finding. He found the full transcript of my interview with Ed Barkafogli on the website of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, Ed's unit. He contacted the website and sent it copies of John's pictures and his letters because he felt there should be more of his story than just that anecdote about his premonition. And he visited John's grave at the American Cemetery in Normandy. One day, a guide named Sophie is leading a tour of the American Cemetery when she notices an envelope propped up against one of the plain white crosses. In it is a letter from a young Belgian photographer named Ivan Lariche. He writes that he saw John's picture on the internet and he read his letters and he was compelled to write and thank him for his sacrifice. So one day, Sophie is telling a tour group the story of the letter. Among the visitors is Mary Kay Bosshart, an American expatriate who keeps a blog called Out and About in Paris. She asked at the office if they could put her in touch with both Tom and Yvonne, which they do. Soon, military history buffs and French reenactors get involved, and John is becoming an iconic figure in the story of D-Day. Among the things Tom learned is that John was actually killed on June 8th, the second day after the invasion. And this is the thing that blows me away. He was initially buried in a temporary grave on Utah Beach next to the temporary grave of the only American chaplain to be killed on D-Day. Incidentally, Father Ignatius Maternowski, a Franciscan priest, was a New Englander from Holyoke, Massachusetts. I'm going to play two audio clips. Oh, wait, this is, that's Tom, and that's Ivan Lariche, the young Belgian photographer. Okay, now I'm going to play two audio clips, and they illustrate the highs and lows of World War II, almost compacted into very short space. What do I do? Okay, first one.
Notice your rank. I was a private, UFC corporal, private, PFC corporal. I was a little bad in the service. I was with two gentlemen, two Marines, I should say, from Chicago, Hudlow and McDowell. They were two crazy guys, and I joined them too. And they were my squad, and we had a lot of fun. We got away with it. You said, tell me what kind of trouble you would get into if you can with your phone. Wasn't dating or anything else like that. Or an incident happened one night. The three of us, in fact, there were about 5 or 6 of us walking, and we see this big door open like this, big office. Then we're taking the pencils and and I took the chair with rose on, and I put one of the guys on the chair with rose. Said, "My son, I'm pushing, and I can't go nowhere." They had my duty belt. Stop me. It was an empty marina. God, where did you guys get the stuff and all? And we had a court martial. And we got away with it because we didn't rob it. What we took was pencils and that one chair. Good time. What were your thoughts crossing the ocean? I didn't have much thought. I didn't think nothing of getting killed, shot, or anything. I was very, very, we all talked and had a good time. We didn't say you're going to die or anything like that. And this is my buddy.
Richard D. Anderson.
Anderson. Yeah.
February 1, 1944.
Uh-huh.
Entering a shell crater occupied by 3 other Marines. Private First Class Anderson. Were you one of the Marines? Okay. Private First Class Anderson was preparing to throw a grenade at an enemy position when it slipped from his hands and rolled toward the man at the bottom of the hole. With insufficient time to retrieve the armed weapon and throw it, Private First Class Anderson fearlessly chose to sacrifice himself and save his companions by hurling his body upon the grenade and taking the full impact of the explosion. His personal valor and exceptional spirit of loyalty in the face of almost certain death were in keeping with the highest traditions of the U.S. Naval Service. He gallantly gave his life for his country. Now, was he in your platoon? You trained with him and everything?
I guess he was the fourth guy that we used to go out with. Hello was killed on Evo, and McDowell lost his leg on Saipan. I almost lost my eye on the Kwajalein right after that.
You know, that shows like the arc of the war. That I forgot to say was Nick Pachulo. He was in the 4th Marine Division, wounded on Kwajalein and twice on Iwo Jima. Speaking of Iwo Jima, on the Newington, New Britain border near Central Connecticut State University is the only Iwo Jima memorial built and paid for by the state's survivors of the Battle of Iwo Jima. And it honors 99 Connecticut young men who died on Iwo Jima. And also these friends of mine, Gary Roy and Marian Mihalio, who have a thing called the World War II Legacy Foundation, recently opened the first World War II exclusive museum in Connecticut, in East Hartford. And they're experts on Iwo Jima. And I asked them if anyone of the 99 were from Fairfield County. There were none from Bethel, and there were 4. And if I can find it, I've got their names here. There were PFC Ludwig Halles, Corporal William Stolzenberg, and Lieutenant Herbert Wildman, all of Danbury, and David Winspur of Monroe. Okay, now this next clip is of a fellow named, I gotta push this. Whoop.
Yep.
It went, okay.
Ready?
No, a fellow Koenig Tomasian. He was a 19-year-old B-29 gunner, and his plane exploded in flight and over Burma, over Thailand actually, but he was a prisoner of the Japanese in Burma, and he was beaten, he was starved, it was really traumatic. And this is a clip from his interview.
Was American and getting close to, I don't know. I don't know. Was it? I don't know. I don't want. So I'm going to go home. So, the pilot went, if you want to see a sight, look out your right side window. So. And we went down. I must have gotten permission to do this, I guess. We go down, way down, and then around the Statue of Liberty. Let's try my head. Oh, Jesus. Shit, I guess. I don't know this time I do that. I said this one. I'm sorry, you know. So then I up to somewhere where I got released, up to somewhere and came up. And I got up on 91st Street and went around my corner and I'm bouncing to the I stopped my bag and I put the bag and I picked up the ball and a little kid comes up and says, "Hey, give me a ball, you know, that's your snack box." I was home.
You know, just the low, you know, the emotional scene of seeing the Statue of Liberty after all that, and then coming back and having an incident like that. It's like a roller coaster. And that has, you know, not every interview I've done is as compacted as that, but it really is illustrates what the war was like for many of the people who were in it. But I have a little more I'd like to talk about, but I know there's some veterans here. I'd like you to, you know, to stand up and introduce yourself, if you could. No veterans here? He's a veteran. Vietnam era. Yeah, you got to stand up. Thank you for your service.
I figured I'm gonna be called anyway, so I'm gonna push it up. And then I went to Fort Dix, and then I got a letter to go down to Fort Myers, and I didn't know where that was. And I looked on a map, and oh, that's outside the Pentagon. So that's where I went, Fort Myers. South
Virginia,
Pole.
yeah.
The North Pole is too many unknown soldiers, the guards up there, so that's spit and polish, and we were like maybe the opposite of that. And I worked in the Pentagon for like 2 years and came home occasionally and had a very good time, but we were married in that period, and then my wife went to Virginia. She didn't really like Virginia, so she went home. I couldn't go out of state. And then I got discharged and said goodbye. So,
Well, thank you. Now you did your part. And does anybody have any questions that you'd like answered before I continue? In 1999, I went to Germany to a little village called Heimboldshausen, where a buddy of my father was killed. And I lined up 2 German historians to meet me there. And one of the German historians, when he was a 12-year-old boy, he captured an American flyer, a navigator who had bailed out of his plane during a battle up 20,000 feet above. And that battle was one of the most spectacular air battles of the war. It was called the Castle Mission, Kassel. It was a 300 plane raid on the city of Kassel, an industrial city. The target was a factory that made parts for the engines for the Tiger tanks. One plane flew off course. There was like cloud cover, 100% cloud cover. And the lead plane of one bomb group of 35 planes, there were several groups, one behind the other. But the plane in the first section, the lead plane, the machine for seeing through the clouds malfunctioned. And it flew off course, and 34 planes was like, follow the leader, had to follow. They knew they were off course, but there was nothing they could do. It was a split-second decision had to be made. The rest of the group continued to the target. These 35 planes, the lead plane decided to go to a secondary target and drop the bombs. They missed. But anyway, unbeknownst to them, their fighter protection remained with the main bomb group. So there are no P-38s and P-41s and P-51s, their little friends, who had given them such great protection. They were like on their own. They were heavily armed. The B-24 had like 8 machine guns. They dropped their bombs, flew for about 10 minutes. They were regrouping to head back to England when they were ambushed by more than 100 German fighter planes. Of the 35 planes, 4, count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 made it back to their base in England. 6 crash landed in Allied occupied territory in France and Belgium with few casualties, but 25 bombers were shot down. It was the largest loss for a single bomb group in 8th Air Force history. Each plane had about 10 men, and of the crews, about half survived and became prisoners of war, and about half were killed. This is a photo, not a photo, it's a photo of a painting that was commissioned by the daughter and son-in-law of one of the 4 pilots who made it back. They wanted to preserve his legacy, so this aviation artist studied he read a lot of my interviews, which I wound up doing, and they had charts and they had crew lists and everything, but the 100 German fighter planes, their goal was to fly through, to break up the formation. If they ran out of ammunition, they were supposed to ram a plane, because at this point in the war, in September of 1944, Germany was getting the crap bombed out of them. A mouse couldn't walk across the street without being bombed. And so it was almost like desperation. Then the B-24s also shot down something like 27 of the German fighter planes. So the 12-year-old kid, when he grew up, his whole family a month later was killed in a bombing, and he grew up, became a town official, and he started doing all this research. And one day, he didn't speak a word of English, but he had a friend who was a translator for an American base nearby. And the friend sent out all these queries. And one day, 19-year-old navigator who he captured gets this letter. And it says he's looking for the navigator, and it was him, so he met the German kid who had captured him, and he went over to Europe. And meanwhile, two survivors, one bombardier who became a prisoner of war, and one pilot who made it back to England, but not their home base. His plane was shot up so badly that there was a wounded man on board. They carried him out through a hole in the side of the plane. And these two survivors pretty much devoted their retirements, and even before they retired, to writing letters and visiting the archives and collecting documentation, documenting this battle, because so little was known about it. And it was so, such a furious thing. Meanwhile, the German historian and the survivors group, they decide to put up a monument in Germany where the lead plane crashed. I don't have a picture of it. It's in one of my books. But the monument is 3 slabs. One tells the story of the battle, and one of the others has the names of 117 Americans and 17 German fighter pilots who died in the battle. The two sides coming together. It's such a remarkable story of closure, which brings me back to Iwo Jima. At the 1990 ceremony of the battle, they had a ceremony at the monument. Now, one thing I hadn't mentioned was the battle took place above what became the dividing line between East and West Germany. So that 12 of the bombers crashed in East Germany, and the crash sites were not accessible to anyone from the West until 1990. And it turned out that 1990, they had a ceremony. It wasn't the dedication, but they had a big ceremony at the monument, and a lot of American families came over. And there was a little cemetery where 5 of the Americans had been buried in East Germany. It might have been 6 or 7, but several of the American victims were buried in this little cemetery beneath it was marked by a cross called the Gerstungen Cross. It was the village of Gerstungen. And a woman named Sarah Shane Noer, Noer like Noor, Naugher. Sarah's from Mississippi. Her husband was a pilot who was killed in the battle, and she was 5 months pregnant. And she comes to the ceremony with her daughter, who's now grown up. And she wanted to see, this was the first time that little cemetery was accessible. So she goes to the cemetery, and there's a little old German lady there. And Sarah asks where her husband was buried, and she shows her the cemetery. And the German lady says, this is so strange. Nobody has ever come and asked about this cemetery. And just this morning, a young man was here asking where his father was buried, because his father had been a German pilot who was buried in the cemetery, but because he lived in West Germany, this was the first time he could be over there. So later that day, Sarah's daughter and the German son, whose father died in the battle before he was born, met. They've been lifelong friends. Now, Sarah was 5 months pregnant, right? And she knew her husband had been killed in the battle. Now, the battle was on September 27, right? September, October, November, December, January, February, right? What took place in February of 1945? The Battle of Iwo Jima, right? So if the pilot's name was Jim Shane, and if she had a son, naturally she was going to name the boy Jim. And she had a daughter. What's she going to do? And she had a friend over, and what can I name her? They were talking about how to name her daughter. And the friend, there was a newspaper on the table, pointed to the newspaper and said, how about that? And it was a big headline about Iwo Jima. So she named her daughter Jima. So that's the connection to Iwo Jima. And anyway, there's one living survivor of this battle. His name is Jim Bainham. He was a 20-year-old B-24 pilot. His plane was shot down, and 3 of his crew members were murdered on the ground by the civilians. Actually, they were like labor camp guards, some of whom were executed at the Dachau war crimes trials, after the trials. Now, Jim, the pilot, the Castle Mission Historical Society has a tremendous amount of archives, right? And one day they got a query from the cousin of Hector Scala, who was Jim's navigator, who was murdered on the ground. And his cousin was a Rosie the Riveter. And he was like her favorite cousin, and she asked if she wanted information. So they put her in touch with Jim, and he was a widower, and they wound up getting married. It's really a wonderful story. And they were together for like 8 or 9 years, and then she passed away. He's still alive. He's 100 years old. He just fell down and broke some bones, and I think, it's just a shame. But that's Jim at his 100th birthday. So I think he's 101 now. But when he was 99, he painted this. And that's the way the battle lived in his memory. The chaos. I guess. Oh, okay. Now, there's one more clip. Do I have time for another clip? This is a pilot, one of the pilots who made it back to the base, named Paul Swafford. And I interviewed him in Florida.
Mostly from last to August, was all of the violations and target information out of the planes, and we lost that mission and the results of the month.
It's first said about the Castle Mission.
Really, too. There's something that's a very good writing. I was just doing that about 7 years ago. He was a captain at the time. He was the adjutant. Mr. Elson says, September 27, 1924 began the early days of the month. He showed signs of probable rainfall and we put up a mission. But in 4 hours, we were to learn that just another day. It was the most tragic day in the history of the group. And it was probably disastrous raid of a single move in Air Force history. Our assigned target was Castle. 37 of our ships set out for the target. It was a complete gas mission. And after watching the IP, the boat turned and presumably headed for the target. Actually, they were headed for Gage, which was approximately 4 miles northeast of Castle. It got the bones about half a mile short of Burton. They didn't know that they was prescribed, but they were out of the bone screen. So the team trying and following. Suddenly, the barrel of the struggle gunners. Gerald had made excellent looks of cover, and they had reached the rope's altitude in good time. German fighters passed the driving about airways, and the destruction of the ships practically. Our gunners did not go covered and managed to inflict the heavy loss of their attackers. Many of our ships were loading earthworm in flames. It seemed to be raining parachutes. Aerial battles divided on the head of the scene. Too late to save our group, although they also managed to destroy several of the rocket fighters. The entire battle took less than 5 minutes, and we lost all 5 boats and ships at the scene of the tragedy. In addition, 2 ships crashed landed in France. 2 Anston Haven. 25th cracked open the facility of our base. The total casualty list showed 1 killed, 13 injured, 216 in action. Now, those missing in action were eventually officially listed as killed in action, and a percentage managed to survive the crash or parachute into safety. Finally, after their liberation from captivity by advancing Allied ground forces, the group had running for the official change of status of the 36 men indicated 15 officers and 63 enlisted men were prisoners of war, and 13 unknown had been declared dead. As for the German officers, our governors were officially credited with the destruction of 23 fighters, with an additional 5 probably destroyed. Of course, this represented the total exacted by and credited to the returning and surviving crews. It was known for certain that other losses were also inflicted on the Germans. Other columns had not returned to our base to report influence. Any of these survivors captured in the cemetery of the area in which most of the group planes crashed, tailed by the Germans that gathered up the bodies. In the disaster which had developed at a time, the many seats and Bethel gave evidence that slavery also the blow was a serious one. The squadron's personnel would allowing weary hours to assemble quickly the questionable attacks of the name. The placement crops had been arranged for since the group fighting strength had been decimated. At first, it was very low that some of the crops from various groups of the division. At the second division, frantic steps were taken by headquarters at the Fox Squadrons and nightfall was abandoned, and a decision was made to divert all of the crews and the temple division to our group to get the point straight as quickly as possible. This was a slow process. It proved to be the logical step. In addition, it was a tremendous task to assemble personal records, make out various personnel, operational and intelligence reports, and to go quickly the jobs that was required by existing regulations in the case of casualties. Such a catastrophe affecting the group in countless ways.
The following day, Alan Root called a gallant formation of people ships. It was target was the and castle. All the ships returned safely after scoring by the crew another excellent Beckett.
Yeah, he was reading from the unit history, which was written, right at the end of the war, where they didn't know the outcome of many of the people in the battle. Is there enough time for me to read Johnny Dorm's, the letter that was written to Johnny Dorm? Oh, I do. All right. Yeah, I just thought if there was time, I would read Yvonne's letter to John because it shows what the American participation in the war meant to the people overseas, to the people in Belgium, Holland. Le 1 November 2007 is when he wrote this. Dear John, we don't know each other. We know nothing of each other's lives, and even so, I feel I owe you so much. I know nothing of you or so little. I don't know what were your tastes, your hobbies, your favorite music, or if you had a girlfriend back home. I don't know what you loved in life, your too short life. John, you've been buried here for over 60 years in this land of France that saw your last days. These last days where you fought for the liberation of a country, a whole continent, and a civilization. When I found your picture, I started thinking a lot about you, your face, your pink cheeks, almost the face of a child. Your smile tells me you must have been mischievous, cheerful, and full of life. Then I felt a deep sorrow because I know that on that day of June 6, 1944, when you jumped into the cold black night on the Normandy beach, you must have been terrified. Terrified before the unknown, terrified at the thought of never seeing your family again, of losing your army companions, of being alone, of death itself. Nevertheless, you survived that historic night and fought for 2 long days before you fell on June 8th. I wonder, how were the last moments of your life with who you were? From the bottom of my heart, I hope that you were not alone, because I know that your comrade in arms must have done everything to protect you, to reassure and comfort you. I read the letters that were addressed to your parents when you passed away and realized that you were very much appreciated by your army companions. Before I leave, John, I would like to tell you how much I am aware that your ultimate sacrifice and the ones of thousands of men like you has allowed me and all of us to live in a land of freedom and peace. For all of this, I am sincerely grateful. So I promise you that every time I will travel to Normandy, I will come visit you to honor your memory. I will lay my hand on your white cross so that you are not alone in the dark anymore. I will keep your memory alive in my heart, and I will never forget what you have done for us, done for me, for our liberty, for all of us. See you soon, and may God bless you. Yvonne, Belgique. I only saw that, when I was putting together this talk and I Google. Now, if you get a chance, if you're Googling, if you Google his name, and you'll find the issue of Out and About in Paris, it's just lovely. She's a wonderful photographer, and she tells the story of the letter. She did 2 blog posts. One when she learned about it, and one on the next Veterans Day when she was there. If you can find either of them, they're really something. Anyway, that's about it for this evening. Some of my books are over there, including one with my full interview with Arnold Brown, which is he was really quite a character. Thank you very much, and thank you, Tom.
Thank you everyone for attending. We've got, our next one on D-Day is January 17th.